I'm Mark Turner, and I'm 36 years old. Everything meaningful in my life centers on my little girl, Emma. I adopted her when she was just 2. From the moment I saw her, those wide blue eyes, that shy, crooked grin, the way her tiny hand curled around my finger, I knew she would change me forever. She doesn't carry my blood, but she is my daughter in every sense of the word. Not everyone in my family feels that way. My parents, David, 62, and Linda, 58, never hid their disappointment the day I announced I was adopting. Why not find a woman and have a real child? My mother asked, her voice dripping with disdain. My father didn't bother with tact. She's not our blood, Mark, he said flatly. Each word felt like a slap, but I kept my mouth shut. I believed they'd come around once they saw how sweet and bright Emma is. A few years back, my parents lost both their jobs. Dad's factory closed and Mom's office downsized. They asked me for help, and like any good son, I obliged. I've been covering half their mortgage on the old family home every month. It wasn't small change, but I work as a project manager for a tech firm in Seattle. I could afford it. My sister Sarah, 34, lives 2 blocks away with her girls Ava, 8, and Mia, 5. When they visit Grandma and Grandpa, they're spoiled rotten. Toys, treats, rides in the car, the works. Emma, on the other hand, is often left out. I tried convincing myself it was just oversight, not cruelty. I wanted the cousins to grow up close to share the bonds I had with Sarah when we were kids. That Monday morning, I packed Emma's little purple backpack with her favorite stuffed bear and a couple of picture books. I told her, "Have fun at Grandma's. I'll pick you up after work." She beamed, clutching my hand. I kissed her cheek. She waved as I drove away, and I felt a calm wash over me. I was sure she'd be safe. I thought they'd show her the same kindness they'd once shown me. I was wrong. I drove home that evening with a storm in my chest, the city lights blurring as I clutched the steering wheel, replaying Emma's tear-streaked face on a loop. Every red light felt like a countdown to confrontation, every honk a reminder that time was slipping away. I felt the old fear rising, the fear of failure, of not being enough to protect the child I loved more than life itself. But beneath that fear flickered a stubborn flame of resolve. I would not let anyone diminish her worth again. When I pulled into the driveway, the front door had a fresh splinter along the frame, as if someone had forced it open. My heart thudded, and I took a moment to breathe before stepping inside. The house smelled of stale air and cold silence, and Emma wasn't in the living room. My panic spiked, and I called her name, voice echoing through empty rooms. Then I heard a muffled sob from the kitchen. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me through a maze of memories that seemed to whisper warnings at every turn. Whispers about trust, betrayal, blood ties, and the lies we tell ourselves to feel safe. In the kitchen, I found her perched on a chair, half hidden behind the island counter. Her hand clutched the crayon drawing she'd made that afternoon, 3 stick figures under a bright sun, one of them small and drawn in black, standing apart. She held it to her chest, tears glinting on her cheeks like dew. I kneeled beside her, heart hammering as I tried to steady my voice. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm here. Everything's going to be okay." She looked at me, eyes full of both relief and fear, and in that moment, I knew our fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. I scooped her up, wrapping my arms around her trembling body, and carried her to the living room couch. She buried her face in my shirt, and I felt her little shoulders shake with fresh sobs. I sat there holding her, heart breaking, while outside the wind rattled the windows like an intruder trying to shatter our fragile peace. That wind sounded almost like mocking laughter, reminding me that the world outside these walls was still a battlefield. I clenched my jaw and made myself a silent vow, no matter what it took, I would build a fortress around her heart. That night, I paced the floor instead of sleeping. I thought back to the mortgage my family lost, the eviction that forced them onto the street, while Emma and I sat in this living room, safe and warm. I felt anger flare and die like embers in my chest. Part of me wanted to march out there, drag them back inside, and show them what real family meant. but another part, colder and sharper, weighed the risks. If I chose vengeance, could I still be the father she deserved? Or would I become the kind of person who cared more about payback than love? The next morning, I stood in front of Emma's bedroom door, listening to her quiet breathing. I thought about what it meant to be a father who protects and provides, and what it meant to love unconditionally. My religion had taught me forgiveness, but my heart rebelled at the thought of forgiving those who had hurt my child. Was mercy a weakness? Or was it a strength to show grace even when it's hardest? The moral conflict twisted in my gut like a storm cloud pregnant with lightning. The sunlight crept into her room, painting the walls with golden stripes where the curtains parted. I knelt beside her, stroking her hair away from her forehead, and whispered, "I promise you from now on, no one's ever going to tell you you're less than worthy." She answered with a sleepy nod, eyes heavy, words muffled. And as she drifted back to sleep, I realized the fight wasn't just against my parents' cruelty or society's narrow definitions of family. It was against every doubt and fear inside me, every voice that whispered I wasn't enough. I would have to risk everything, my heart, my career, my reputation, to prove that love is more powerful than bloodlines and that a father's word can move mountains. Yet beneath that resolve lay a tremor. Was I ready to burn old bridges to face the world alone with just Emma at my side? I found the crayon drawing she'd made and taped it above my desk at the office that morning. It was simple, the little black stick figure standing apart under the sun, but it held the weight of a promise I would never let her feel alone again. Later, during a morning meeting, I caught myself doodling hearts instead of taking notes, eyes flicking to that sketch taped to my laptop screen. My colleagues noticed and threw curious glances my way, but I didn't care. Their stares were a small price to pay for the clarity filling my mind. That afternoon, I left work early, telling my boss I had a family emergency. The truth was, I needed to do something risky to confront my parents, to reclaim my past, to redefine my future. I drove to the foreclosure auction site where their old home had been sold. The neighborhood looked the same, but the porch was gone, replaced by a sterile for sale sign and fresh paint over chipped wood. It felt like a wound stitched closed but never healed. Standing there, I realized this was another turning point. I could accept that loss as final, or I could fight to resurrect what had been broken. I imagined walking up to that silent house, paper in hand, ready to file a claim for emotional damages and demand my share of dignity. But law and justice weren't enough. I needed something more personal, a confrontation that would challenge their beliefs about family as much as it healed ours. The sun slipped behind a cloud, and in that slipping light, I felt a pulse of electricity. I was ready to challenge them in the only way they would understand. In the days that followed, I gathered evidence photos of Emma's tear-streaked face receipts. For every mortgage payment, I'd made copies of emails where my parents had questioned her worth. I printed them in color, each sheet a vivid accusation against the people who should have been her protectors. Then I crafted a letter not to the bank or the courts, but directly to them. I poured every ounce of my hurt, anger, and resolve onto that page, demanding an explanation in person. I ended the letter with one simple question. Why did you choose to love only those who carried your blood? I slipped the letter under their new door, one gray morning, heart pounding like war drums in my chest. I wondered if they would tear it up in rage or read it in despair. As I walked away, I felt the weight of risk settle on my shoulders. I was exposing their worst selves and staking my relationship with them on their response. If they refused to answer, I would know that the bonds we shared were irreparably broken. But if they came forward, maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to force them to see Emma as she truly was, a child of light and laughter, deserving of every ounce of love they had withheld. And in that moment, every doubt and every fear coalesced into a single glittering hope that carried me forward, straight into the storm I had unleashed. I drove home that evening with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. The highway lights blurred into streaks of yellow and red as I squeezed the steering wheel, replaying Emma's little sobs in my mind like a cruel lullaby. Every mile I covered felt as if I were fleeing from something, my guilt, my anger, my failure, all wrapped up in the image of her tear-streaked face. I'd promised to build a fortress around her. But as I pulled into the driveway and stared at that battered front door, I realized my fortress already had cracks. The splintered wood looked like a bleeding wound in our home's smile. I swallowed hard, whispered her name, and stepped inside each footstep louder than the last until the silence pressed against me. I called again, voice unsteady, and finally heard the faintest whimper from the kitchen. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Is this what it meant to betray the person you love most? In the kitchen, Emma sat on a chair too tall for her legs to reach the floor, clutching her latest crayon drawing. 3 stick figures under a crudely drawn sun, one figure smaller and sketched in charcoal, stood apart from the others. She'd tried to hide behind the island, but her red-rimmed eyes gave her away. I dropped to my knees, hands trembling as I brushed the damp strands of hair from her face. She sniffled, held up that drawing as if it were a lifeline. "They don't see me, Daddy," she whispered, voice so small it could have been a broken fairy's. I wrapped her in my arms, tasted her tears on my shirt, and felt something inside me snap free from its cage of fear, fury, bright and dangerous. I wanted to scorch every last trace of indifference from the walls of that house. But as I carried her to the couch, I also felt something else, a nagging doubt that vengeance might cost her more than it healed. That night, I lay beside her bed, watching her drift into uneasy sleep, and wrestled with the sharp edges of my own code. I'd spent years paying my parents' mortgage, covering their bills, protecting their home. I'd done it because family was sacred, an unbreakable chain. But what chain binds you to people who teach your daughter she's worthless? I reached for my phone thumb, hovering over the screen as I typed and erased message after message to Mom and Dad, each word a brittle shard. Forgiveness? No. Apology? Maybe. Explanation? Definitely demanded. By dawn, I'd drafted a letter that cataloged every insult, every cruel word, the day they spat useless at a 6-year-old, the time they ignored her birthday cake, the countless moments they valued blood over love. I signed it with a flourish and taped it to their new front door. Then I sat on my couch in the dim morning light, watching sunlight creep in stripes across the hardwood, and wondered if paper could ever force open hearts as stubborn as theirs. The next day at work was torture. I balanced budgets and timelines, but my mind drifted to Emma's drawing taped above my desk, her tiny figure under that unforgiving sun. My colleagues threw curious glances when I stared at the sketch, mid-meeting doodling hearts around the margins of spreadsheets. One coworker, Kevin, whispered something about always knew you'd be soft on kids, and I clenched my jaw so tight it ached. That offhand remark stung with the truth that society still sees adoption as second best, as if love were a currency divisible by blood. My protest licked at my throat, but I swallowed it down. I'm the adult here. I can't fly off the handle in a boardroom. Yet each comment, each sideways glance became a brick in my resolve. I would redefine family in everyone's eyes, starting with our small circle. But to do that, I had to risk losing more than just my parents' approval. I might lose my own sense of safety. When I got Emma from her after-school program, I took her to the neighborhood park. She bounded ahead, laughter like fireworks chasing the swings. I watched other families' dads pushing strollers, moms comparing baby clothes, grandparents giving ice cream cones. Some looked at Emma and me with curious eyes, 2 figures who didn't quite fit the mold. I took her hand and said, "Ready to conquer the world." She nodded, cheeks pink. We climbed the slide together, and as I lifted her up, I felt the shift my fight had expanded beyond the walls of our home. It was against every whisper that told us we didn't belong, every rule that said love needed lineage to be real. But as she reached the top and slid into my arms, her face alight, I knew I was ready for that fight. That evening, my phone pinged with a notification the letter I'd slid under my parents' door had been delivered. No reply yet, just the read receipt blinking back at me. I stared at it as if it could speak. Then in the quiet hum of my apartment, I realized the outcome didn't matter. It was the act itself, naming the cruelty, demanding recognition, that had changed us. A storm was coming, and I didn't know if they'd rise to meet it or vanish into silence. But I did know this: I wasn't backing down. Not for any comfort or fear, because Emma deserved more than a world that measures love in drops of blood. And as that final thought settled in my bones, I felt a spark of hope flare like a new dawn rising over a broken horizon, daring me to believe in a tomorrow we'd build together. I woke up the next morning to the dull glow of my phone screen lighting up with read under the letter I'd slipped beneath my parents' door. No reply, no forwarded apology, nothing but a digital footprint telling me they'd acknowledged my words. My stomach knotted tighter than a drawstring bag, and I realized that silence wasn't peace, it was their answer. I paced the living room without really looking at anything. The couch, the coffee table, Emma's shoelaces lying half undone. Every second I hesitated. I felt the ground beneath me shifting, as if the home I knew could vanish at any moment. Then I did something wildly impulsive. I drafted a public post on my social feed, not naming names, but describing my heartbreak the way bloodlines had become a weapon, how a 6-year-old ended up scrubbing dishes she couldn't reach while her cousins laughed. I typed and erased my thumb, hovering over share. If I pressed it, I'd risk my privacy. My parents' fury, even my job security yet holding back, felt like caging Emma's agony. I stared at the blinking cursor and thought to fight for her dignity. Do I have to expose our family's darkest wound to the world? By mid-morning, the office buzzed with whispers. Someone had pushed like under a thread about breaking family cycles, and another had shared it with a comment. We all deserve better than blood prejudice. My boss Karen cornered me by the break room coffee machine, brow creased so tightly it looked painful. Mark, we love your passion, she said. Voice low, but social media can bleed into our brand. You sure you want this fight in public? I clutched my mug like a lifeline and met her gaze. I want Emma to know she belongs somewhere everywhere, I replied, voice firmer than I felt. Around me, colleagues poured sugar and cream, eavesdropping. Their curiosity stung, but instead of retreating, I let a small spark of defiance light in my chest. If work crumbled around me, at least my daughter would stand on solid ground. I walked back to my desk with every eye trailing behind my heartbeat, echoing a single mantra: love is stronger than fear. That afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice trembled like glass about to shatter. They're packing their shitty rented room, she blurted. Mom says she can't face being cut off from everything. Dad's blaming you for their misery. My chest tightened. Of course they were desperate until I demanded they see Emma as family. Their granddaughters felt they had no choice but to make me the villain. Sarah's tears tremored through the line. You're tearing the family apart, she accused, even though it was their own cruelty that split it first. I closed my eyes, picturing Emma coloring quietly in the next room. Her laughter, a faint spark I couldn't let die. I'm not tearing anyone apart, I said quietly. I'm giving her a chance to belong. But her silence cut me to the bone. Blood ties or not, I realized I was standing on the edge of everything I'd ever known, ready to leap into an uncertain void for my daughter's sake. When I opened the front door that evening, I found Emma sitting on the porch steps clutching a new crayon drawing, 2 figures holding hands underneath a stormy cloud with a tiny sun peeking out. One figure, hers, was bright as daylight. The other, mine, was shaded half in shadow. She looked up at me, eyes earnest. Daddy, will our cloud ever clear? She asked, voice small but steady. My throat tightened as I knelt beside her, brushing a smear of crayon from her cheek. The storm outside rattled the window panes, a whisper that battles often come before breakthroughs. I felt every risk I'd taken, every fence I'd burned, crystallize into a single truth. I would walk through fire to show her that storms pass and suns emerge. Yet in that moment, as thunder rolled over our home, I realized the real test was still ahead. Could I forgive my parents enough to rebuild, or would I stand here forever holding her hand against the darkness? And as Emma pressed her drawing into my chest, the question hung between us, thunderous and unresolved. I woke before sunrise, restless, with thoughts pounding against the back of my skull like an insistent drumbeat. My phone lay on the nightstand, its screen dark, until finally the glow of notifications spilled across the room. I tapped it open and stared at the post I'd shared, a raw account of Emma's tears, of my parents' cruelty, of the way society still whispers that love requires blood. Comments scrolled beneath, some voices lifted me up with words of solidarity. Family is chosen, not born, one read, while others leveled icy judgment. Shameful to air your private life, insisted a critic. Each ping felt like a drop of acid on my skin, reminding me of how deeply this fight cut. I closed my eyes, breathing through the surge of adrenaline and doubt. Should I retreat? What if this blew back on Emma? Yet as I scrolled, a direct message notification popped up from a stranger named Claire, who claimed she'd once stood where I stood, an adoptive parent waging war against blood-obsessed lineage, and found her daughter stronger for it. Her message offered support, but also a challenge. Are you ready to take it further? That simple question hovered in the dawn light, setting my pulse racing. In that moment, the quiet of my apartment felt like a battlefield, and I realized I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I would have to choose between the shelter of silence and the risk of change. At the office, the hum of computers and the clack of keyboards felt distant, as though I were watching from underwater. My colleagues chatted about weekend plans, unaware of the storm brewing in my mind. Then my phone buzzed again, this time a call from a local news outlet. Reporter voice steady and professional, they'd seen my post, wanted to run a story about adoption bias in our city. My heart nodded. I'd fought so hard to create a private haven for Emma. Would inviting cameras obliterate what little sanctuary remained? Still, the chance to shift public perception was irresistible. If one family story could awaken empathy in hundreds, maybe we could redraw the lines of who deserves love. I requested privacy. No faces of minors. Just my voice, but knew that was a fragile promise on live television. By the time I hung up, my palms were slick with sweat and adrenaline, and every step back to my desk felt like walking a tightrope. I glanced at the crayon drawing taped to my monitor, Emma's little figure under a storm cloud, and promised her I wouldn't let this exposure drown her spirit. Yet even as I made that vow, I wondered if I was risking too much. Would courage become recklessness, or could boldness become a new kind of protection? Leaving work early, I navigated downtown streets slick with glowing reflections of twilight neon. My mind replayed the upcoming interview. What to say, what to keep hidden, how to frame our story as one of resilience rather than victimhood. When I pulled up in front of the reporter's unmarked sedan, Emma peeked over my shoulder, her dark curls brushing my collar. She'd sensed the tension draped around me. I knelt to her level and ran a thumb across her cheek. You ready to show people how amazing you are? She nodded, gripping my hand like a lifeline. We climbed into the back seat together, the scent of vinyl and ambition mingling in the car's tight space. The reporter introduced herself as Sophie, a petite woman with steel blue eyes that held a mix of empathy and curiosity. As she asked Emma about her favorite games, the tension in my chest eased watching my daughter light up. Then Sophie paused, the recorder turning to me with a quiet confession. She was adopted too, and she'd spent years searching for a sense of belonging. Tears welled in her eyes as she described the moment her own parents first welcomed her. In that second, the project shifted from a news segment to a shared crusade. She proposed a short documentary weaving her story with mine to spotlight the absurdity of blood prejudice. My breath caught. Was I ready to hand over our narrative to a stranger's lens? But Emma's laughter, pure and unguarded, filled the car, and I nodded. If this was what it took to turn private pain into collective change, I would take that leap. On the drive home, the city lights gave way to quiet suburbs, and we passed a mural painted on a brick wall. Dark storm clouds parted by a single golden ray, illuminating a field of wildflowers. My chest tightened at the sight. The mural felt like a sign hope through hardship, beauty born from chaos. But as the car's headlights swept past, the image also reminded me how precarious our journey was. Too much light could blind. Too little could suffocate. Emma sat beside me, clutching her stuffed rabbit eyes bright with 100 questions she'd never ask. I pondered the contradiction. To protect her, I'd have to expose her. To shelter her, I might doom her to invisibility. The phone buzzed again, a call from an unknown number. But I silenced it, determined not to let fear dictate my actions. And yet, as the pavement blurred beneath us, I felt the weight of every choice pressing down, public voice or private sanctuary, advocacy or anonymity. Each path held promise and peril, and I wasn't sure which was safer for the child curled next to me. That evening, after tucking Emma into bed, I sank into the couch with my laptop open to an email draft addressed to Child Protective Services. My hands hesitated above the keyboard. Did I really have to invite state scrutiny into our lives? A few months ago, CPS would have been an abstraction, a horror story whispered in parenting forums. Now it felt like an inevitable checkpoint thanks to the public post and the grandparents' simmering anger. I could almost hear their voices demanding proof that I wasn't an unfit father, that my daughter wasn't in danger under my roof. The flicker of the cursor mirrored the tight coil of my stomach. If I reported preemptively, I could control the narrative, present the truth of Emma's home, my stability, our support network. But I risked being the architect of my own undoing, as any minor misstep in paperwork could trigger a wrenching investigation. And worse, the possibility that for a moment a social worker might look at me and see a neglectful parent rather than a man fighting to redeem a broken family. I stared at the draft, to whom it may concern. 3 words that carried the weight of my worst fears. My finger hovered over send, and I realized that whichever decision I made tonight would redraw our boundaries with society. And I wasn't sure if we'd survive the fallout. Morning arrived with a clear sky, but tension hung in the air like static. I stood outside our front door holding the letter Ms. Daniels from CPS had requested: proof of adoption, proof of stable income, character references. Each sheet of paper felt like a silent witness to my life, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone questioned whether an adoptive father could truly safeguard his child. I led Emma by the hand through our quiet street to downtown, where the CPS office loomed in a squat gray stone building with barred windows. My pulse thundered in my ears as we walked up the stone steps. Inside, the walls were lined with faded family portraits whose subjects stared out with generic smiles. It was the kind of place built on the promise of protection, but steeped in suspicion. Ms. Daniels greeted us with a clipboard, her professional smile polite but reserved. She reviewed each document with meticulous care, eyebrows gently furrowing until she paused at one line: grandparents may contest adoption. The words slammed into me like a physical blow. I'd never imagined my struggle could be used as legal leverage. My fingers tightened around Emma's coat sleeve. I knew that any slip here, any sign of weakness could send us spiraling. And as Ms. Daniels looked up to ask for another reference, someone to vouch for Emma's welfare beyond her father, I realized this meeting was a crucible testing not just my credentials, but my very identity as a parent. After we left the office, I called June, my next-door neighbor, and the closest thing Emma and I had to family. June had weathered her own share of storms as a single mother, and her home had always been a sanctuary of warmth and cookies and bedtime stories. When I asked if she would stand as a character witness, her voice cracked with emotion as she said yes without hesitation. Relief flooded me, but it was tangled with guilt. Should I have to ask anyone at all? Back at our apartment, I searched for something, anything, that could soothe the tension. Then I spotted it, an envelope taped under Emma's drawing on the fridge, scrawled in childish loops. I knelt and peeled it open to find a tiny, shaky note, written partly in pencil, partly in tear-smudged ink. It read, "We're sorry. We miss you. Can we please see you again? Love, Grandma and Grandpa." My heart hammered in my chest. After weeks of silence, this was the first olive branch they'd offered, and from Emma's perspective, it was an invitation. I sat with the note in my hands, breath caught, knowing I faced another crossroads, whether to throw their words into the fire of my anger or hold them out as the first fragile steps toward reconciliation. That night, Emma snuggled under her blanket, clutching her rabbit, oblivious to the storm of decisions swirling above her. I sat on the edge of her bed, torn between the instinct to protect her from any hint of hurt and the desire to teach her forgiveness's fierce power. The crayon sun in her drawings, always peeking through somber clouds, seemed to pulse with possibility, reminding me that light and dark coexist. My parents' apology, so small and hesitant, was a fragment of that light. My rage was a dark gulf I couldn't ignore. If I invited them back, would I be betraying Emma's trust, reopening wounds that still bled? Or would I be showing her that forgiveness is a choice that demands courage? As I stared at her peaceful face, I realized there were no easy answers. Only choices that carried risk, promise, and the chance to redefine what family could mean for us. And so, clutching the little note as if it were both a sword and a shield, I whispered into the quiet room, "Tomorrow we'll decide." I woke before dawn again, the note folded in my palm, feeling heavier than any brick I'd ever lifted. The thin paper Grandma and Grandpa's hesitant olive branch had become both promise and burden. All night, I wrestled with my conscience. If I agreed to see them, would I be teaching Emma that some wounds are worth reopening? Or if I refused, would I condemn her to a life haunted by what-ifs? I paced the living room, eyes fixed on her drawings taped to the walls. Those little suns peeking through storm clouds, reminding me that hope often hides behind fear. I knew I had to decide today because indecision was a prison where Emma's laughter couldn't survive. So I brewed coffee black as midnight and wrote a message proposing neutral ground, a small cafe near the park where we'd laughed together last week. Then I stared at the blinking cursor, heart pounding at the risk I was taking by extending the invitation. And as the sun's first light dusted the horizon, I pressed send, wondering if an apology thin as tissue could rebuild a bridge burned to ash. They arrived an hour later, stepping into the cafe like wary travelers into a minefield. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, her hair loose as she hesitated before pulling out a chair. Dad's jaw was clenched so tightly I feared it might fracture. I stood heart-hammering and offered a stiff nod. "Thanks for coming," I said, voice low. Emma sat between us, small and bright in her new denim jacket. Mom reached out first, trembling, and placed the note on the table. "We're so sorry," she whispered. "We were wrong." But Dad's gaze flicked from me to Emma and back, as if assessing whether she truly belonged to this world. I looked at Mom, whose hands shook like wind-blown leaves, and offered a tight smile. The cafe's chatter faded into a blur as I realized the stakes. If I accepted their apology, I risked opening the door to more pain. If I refused, I risked teaching Emma that some hearts are unredeemable. And as Mom's eyes filled with tears again, I sensed that whatever I chose here would echo through every tomorrow. Mom spoke first, voice cracking. We treated her like a servant because we were afraid of what we didn't understand. She paused, wiping her cheek on her sleeve, and Mom's confession felt like a cracked mirror reflecting 100 buried fears about adoption, belonging, and blood. Dad cleared his throat, but his words came out rough. I thought blood was everything. I believed our history would protect her. Instead, I made her feel like an outsider. His hands gripped the table's edge knuckles, blanching. I studied his face, searching for sincerity beneath years of entitlement. Here was the twist I'd never expected. By forcing me to cut them off, I'd provoked their own reckoning with shame. But the risk was far from over. Would their regret translate into real change, or was this just another performance to salvage their pride? Emma glanced at me, eyes wide and hopeful. And I realized that her faith in forgiveness was more powerful than my cynicism. Yet as Dad's next words hung unspoken between us, I knew the real test was only beginning. Dad swallowed hard and leaned forward. "We wanted to surprise you," he admitted, voice low. "We'd been saving some money to pay off the mortgage entirely. We were going to tell you once we'd done it." My chest tightened so abruptly I could barely breathe. The ground beneath my anger shifted. All those mortgage payments I thought had been charity? What if they had been a painfully slow gift, a hidden love I'd refused to see? I looked at my mother, whose lips trembled with that same confession. We were ashamed to ask for help, so we kept our plans secret. Then when we saw Emma, we froze with fear. We'd failed her. The revelation was a twist of irony so cruel it felt like the universe laughing at my distrust. Suddenly, every sacrifice I'd made, every brick I'd torn out in revenge, took on a new shade of regret. And as the cafe clock ticked on, I realized that forgiving them could mean forgiving myself for misreading their intentions, an even riskier act than the one I'd just taken. I stood, voice shaking even as I tried to steady it. "I paid your mortgage because I loved you, not because I expected anything in return." My words rang through the cafe's hum like a bell. I turned to Emma, whose small hand slipped into mine, anchoring me. "I did it because family means loyalty, but family also means safety, and I watched you break her step by step." My father's eyes looked away, and I realized that exposing their secret gift didn't erase the nights Emma cried over dishes she couldn't reach. I slid the folded note across the table. "Your plans would have meant everything," I said softly, "if you'd told me first. If you'd trusted me." The note lay between us like a fragile ceasefire. Beyond the window, the park's trees swayed in the wind, a reminder that even the hardest roots can bend. Yet as I watched my parents absorb those words, I felt the ground shift again. Would they use this moment to heal or fall back into old defenses? And as the late afternoon sun slanted through the glass, casting long shadows, I knew our next move would decide whether this gathering was a reconciliation or the calm before another storm. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the cafe's awning like a restless spirit. Emma tugged at my sleeve and pointed to a mural on the brick wall across the street, a family of 4 under a giant oak tree, its branches twisted but strong. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do you like it?" I asked. She nodded, eyes alight. "It's us," she said simply. "Different, but together." Her words struck me like lightning. There it was again, that symbol of unity through diversity, cradled by strength and acceptance. Yet, as we lingered by the window, I noticed Dad folding the apology note, hesitation etched in his shoulders. Mom trailed behind him, eyes downcast and unresolved. The mural seemed to mock them, its painted limbs stretching outward while they remained perched on the edge of a choice. And as the cafe's bell tinkled with each departing customer, I realized that even now the invitation to rebuild trust hung in the air, unclaimed and pregnant with possibility, and that the true risk was deciding whether to seize it or let it slip away. That evening, we returned home together, 4 silhouettes in the golden haze of dusk. The front door felt narrower, with both generations crossing its threshold. Inside, I flicked on the lights and paused, catching my reflection in the hallway mirror, sweat on my brow, eyes gritty with tears and coffee. I led them into the living room, where Emma's drawings lined the walls like testaments of hope. Mom pointed at one, a huge yellow sun breaking through dark clouds, and her voice trembled. "She gave us the sun back. but Dad's gaze lingered on the empty space on the mantel where their family photo had once stood, replaced now by a framed quote, "Home is where love resides." He shifted uncomfortably, his old beliefs colliding with this new reality. I stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "If you want back in our home," I said, "it's because you believe here is where love resides." Silence settled thick and fragile, and in that waited moment, every unspoken apology, every unhealed wound balanced on the knife edge of whether they could redefine family not by blood, but by the choice to love unconditionally. The hush stretched until Emma padded forward and laid her small hand on Grandma's, breaking the spell and leaving our future hanging in the balance. I woke to the pale glow of morning slipping through the curtains. The apology note Mom and Dad had left resting on the kitchen table like a fragile bird in a glass cage. Emma patted in, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and asked will they stay for breakfast. Her voice was hopeful, innocent, so unlike the guarded tones Mom and Dad used when they first returned. I poured 2 mugs of cocoa and set them on the counter, the steam curling up like tentative truce flags. As I watched Emma sip, I felt the old fear gnaw at my ribs. What if their remorse was just another echo of guilt destined to fade once our backs were turned? But beneath that fear, a new resolve formed. I would test the strength of their apology, not give in blindly. So I cleared my throat and said, "They want one more chance, but today we'll do things differently." Emma's face lit up like sunrise, and I wondered if I could really risk letting my guard down or if I'd end up exposing her heart to fresh wounds. After breakfast, I slipped into my study and pulled up our shared accounts transaction history. Something about the neat apology felt too tidy, too orchestrated. I scrolled through months of transfers, mortgage payments marked as son's assistance, and then I noticed a series of personal savings withdrawal entries under their new rented address. My heart thumped. They'd been socking money away for months, even as they begged for help. Did they imagine their secrecy would protect me from embarrassment? Or was there a deeper shame at play, a refusal to owe me even when I'd offered my support freely? My fingers hovered above the mouse, the screen's glow reflecting in my eyes. If I called them out now, I'd shatter the fragile peace we'd just begun to build. But if I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in their deception and teach Emma that half-truths are acceptable in the name of pride. The ledger lay between us like an unspoken accusation, so I closed the laptop and decided to confront them face to face. I found Mom in the living room flipping through Emma's sketchbook, her eyes lingering on the drawing of the oak tree we'd planted together. When she saw me, her smile wavered. "You wanted to talk?" she asked, voice gentle but wary. I nodded, motioning for her and Dad to sit. "I need to understand why you hid money from me." I began swallowing the lump of betrayal in my throat. Dad's jaw clenched and he looked at Mom before answering. "We didn't want to burden you when you were already carrying so much." His words came out soft but defensive, as if he were defending a fortress built on shifting sands. Mom reached out and took his hand, voice trembling. "We thought showing we could stand on our own would make you proud. Instead, we hurt the one person we wanted to impress." Their confession hit me like a sudden downpour, something honest after so much stormy silence. Yet, as I watched them, I realized that rebuilding trust would mean risking more than just forgiving. It would mean surrendering my role as protector and becoming a partner in their healing. Could I step into that role, or would I forever stand guard on the other side of a moat? That afternoon, Dad suggested family counseling, a neutral space where a professional could mediate our tangled emotions. The idea prickled with both promise and peril. Bringing a stranger into our private pain could unearth more wounds than it healed. I could almost see Emma, retreating eyes wary of yet another adult probing her family secrets. But I also saw the oak sapling outside its slender trunk, surviving the wildest storms because its roots had been tended by many hands. Maybe inviting someone in was like watering those roots. I took a deep breath and agreed. As soon as I did, Mom's relief became palpable, and Dad's shoulders sagged in gratitude. But as evening shadows stretched across our living room floor, I wondered if therapy was a bridge to reconciliation or a spotlight that would expose every fracture in our fragile bond. The next morning, I walked Emma to school along our quiet street, the oak sapling standing sentinel at the corner. She pointed to a new carving on its bark, "Employ Forever." I knelt to press my palm against hers, feeling the rough grooves beneath our fingers. "Even when things are complicated," I asked. She nodded, eyes bright. "Especially then," she said. I smiled, but inside I churned with anxiety. Our therapy session loomed, and I was about to risk our serenity in the name of progress. Would airing our grievances under fluorescent lights strengthen our family, or would it open a Pandora's box of old resentments? Each step toward the school felt heavier, as if I were trudging through quicksand of my own making. In the counselor's softly lit office, we sat in a circle of mismatched chairs and waited for Dr. Patel to greet us. Her warm eyes scanned the 3 generations before settling on me. "This is a space where every voice matters," she said, and I felt the weight of expectation settle onto my shoulders. Mom spoke first, her words tentative, confessing how she'd measured love in bank statements and blood tests. Dad followed, admitting how fear had twisted his sense of loyalty into a weapon. Then it was my turn. I spoke of Emma's tears, my own fury, and the moment I realized I could no longer protect her by silence. My voice trembled, but the admission of vulnerability felt like setting down a heavy pack. As I paused, the room was silent, so silent it quaked with possibility. I looked at Emma, whose thumbs fiddled with her dress, and I realized that whether this room healed us or divided us further would depend on our next choice to listen or to defend. We left the office under a sky smeared with late afternoon clouds. Emma clutched Mom's hand, babbling about how Dr. Patel said feelings are like weather fronts unseen until they arrive. I watched Mom's face soften as she listened Dad's posture relax beside them. But as we rounded the block, I noticed someone standing at the curb. Clara, my sister, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Her gaze met mine, and I felt a ripple of conflict. She blamed me for the family schism. Now she watched us step from counseling as though we were ants carrying a wounded queen, an affront to her sense of familial order. I swallowed against the sudden tightness in my throat. Would I defend our progress or brace for her attack? And as Clara's lips formed words I couldn't yet hear, I realized the family war wasn't just between my parents and me, it stretched across every relationship we once held sacred, waiting for the next battle to begin. That evening, I sat at my desk drafting an email to Sophie, the journalist who wanted to create our documentary. The therapy had given me new confidence, yet now I hesitated. Would revealing our ongoing sessions to the public inspire others or betray the trust we'd built under closed doors? I stared at the subject line, our story. Therapy update, and felt the cursor blink like a heartbeat. If I sent it, our journey would become a blueprint for families everywhere, but it would also expose Emma to strangers' gaze at her most vulnerable. I thought of the oak sapling again, how it stood tall because its roots were buried deep unseen. Maybe some parts of our story needed to stay underground, sheltered until they were strong enough to face the sun. And with that thought, my finger hovered over send, poised between risk and protection. Late that night, I found Emma asleep on the couch, a faint snore rattling her chest. I draped a blanket over her shoulders and looked around the living room at the scattered remnants of our day, crayon drawings on the fridge, tissues in the bin. Mom's scarf draped over the armchair like a ghost of afternoon warmth. I felt the weight of all the choices we'd made, to invite forgiveness, to confront deceit, to seek help, to possibly share our healing with the world. Each decision carried risk and reward, shadow and light, like the sun piercing storm clouds in Emma's drawings. I knelt beside her and whispered, "Whatever tomorrow brings, we'll face it together." But as I pressed my lips to her forehead, I sensed the final knot forming. The world outside our walls was watching now, and our next step would determine not just our family's fate, but the truth we chose to share with everyone else. Story 2. The judge peered over his glasses as Zoe's lawyer leaned in. "Mr. Reyes," he said, "you built Greendale Gardens from nothing. But now, thanks to your wife's contributions, it's a joint asset." Zoe nodded, arms folded. "Without me, you'd fail," she snapped. I took a breath. "Greendale was mine first," I said quietly. "And it still is." In that moment, I knew everything had changed. I'm Dominic Reyes, 38, and I spent the last 15 years turning raw dirt into living art. I learned to coax life from clay soil, to carve oasis from barren patches, and to dream in green. But the roots of my business go further back to a damp spring morning in my parents' tiny backyard, where my Uncle Julian showed me what gardens could become. Julian was a legend in his day. A landscape architect with clients who paid him to sculpt hillsides into classical terraces, to frame estates in clipped hedges and sweeping lawns. He spotted me one afternoon wrestling with a tangle of weeds and a rusty hand trowel. I had just graduated with a horticulture degree during the housing crash. Perfect timing for luxury gardens, he quipped. "Gardens don't judge the economy," he said, handing me his pruning shears. "They wait." He taught me patience, how to trim a Japanese maple so its branches splay like a dancer's arms, how to mulch a bed so that little seedlings feel safe to break ground. He let me tag along on his projects, but only if I carried his water jug and learned to keep my back straight while digging trenches. By the time I was 24, I was teaching Julian a thing or two. I begged my parents for space in their garage, a corner for a drafting table, a battered stool, and a filing cabinet full of plant catalogs. I scraped together enough cash to buy a second-hand wheelbarrow, a coil of drip irrigation tubing, and a set of hand tools from yard sales. My first clients were neighbors who took pity on me, Mrs. Lynn at number 17, who paid me in leftover bagels, Mr. Wu at number 23, who slipped me a tip in an envelope. I worked sunrise to sunset. My first crew was a college buddy named Leo who hauled rocks and laughed when his arms burned. I paid him in ramen and the promise of experience. My second ally was Aisha, a studio mate with a gift for 3D rendering. She stayed up late translating my sketches into digital walkthroughs that looked almost real. Aisha believed I could turn a scrap of land into a sanctuary, and she wasn't afraid to mock my shaky drafting skills until they improved. By year 3, I'd bought a beat-up pickup with my logo crudely lettered on the door. It broke down twice a week, but I didn't mind. Every repair forced me to learn another skill. I hired Marcus, a retired stonemason, who showed me how to lay flagstone paths that wouldn't shift underfoot. Between us, we discovered new ways to blend rock and planting to mimic nature's randomness. At 26, I rented a small studio above a garden supply shop. It wasn't much peeling paint, a single fluorescent light, no heat in winter. But I hung my renderings on the walls, pinned moss samples to a corkboard, and stashed my notebooks full of planting lists beneath the coffee table. Leo joined me full-time. Aisha turned my napkin sketches into Instagram posts. Marcus wandered in whenever he felt like it, bringing coffee or half-finished stone steps he couldn't leave alone. That's when I met Zoe. It was at Outdoors Expo 2016 in a cavernous convention center smelling of pine oil and hot dogs. I'd snagged the last booth in a far corner between a company selling prefab pergolas and a vendor flogging decorative gnomes. My display was simple, a tabletop model of a woodland nook moss glued to a piece of driftwood, tiny ferns, and a log planter. She walked up while I was explaining how to prune a boxwood into a spiral. Tall, with dark hair cut in a precise bob, she clicked her heels on the concrete floor until I looked up. She wore a tailored blazer and carried a slim laptop covered in stickers from architecture firms. "Dominic Reyes?" she asked. "Your render is stunning. It feels alive." Her name was Zoe Patel, 36. She'd just left a high-end architecture studio where she'd grown bored drawing glass boxes for glass box clients. She specialized in immersive visuals VR experiences that let you wander a design before you built it. "You need someone who can sell the dream," she said. "Let me show your clients what they'll feel, not just what they'll see." We grabbed coffee at a nearby kiosk, jotting ideas on napkins, a courtyard that centered on a sculptural tree, a rooftop garden where clients could pick herbs for dinner, an installation in a children's hospital that would bloom in stages as kids healed. I was skeptical. VR seemed flashy, but Zoe's passion was infectious. She spoke of light, of texture, of how digital tools could coax the shyest homeowner into green. Within 6 weeks, we landed our first big project together, a backyard overhaul for a tech executive who wanted a Zen meets Silicon Valley feel. I picked the stones, mapped the water features, chose the plant palette. Zoe built a 3D walkthrough so real the client teared up when he walked through the garden in his living room. He signed on the spot. By our first anniversary as partners, Greendale Gardens had grown from 2 guys and an old Dodge to a team of 5. Leo as foreman, Aisha head of visualization, Marcus consulting on stonework, and a new hire, Eleni, a recent landscape grad with a sharp eye for native plants. We moved into a real storefront in town, a brick building with a green awning, a workshop in back, and space for meetings up front. At 35, I moved my wife and business partner into our lives. Zoe set up her VR station next to my drafting table. We shared clients' successes, occasional fights over who took care of invoices. But we celebrated every win: our first local design award, our website ranking in the top 10 for sustainability, and our social media blowing up with before and after reels. On our wedding day, standing in a simple garden I'd built for the ceremony, Zoe whispered, "We did this." I held her hand tight. "Together," I said, and for a few years it felt like we were unstoppable. We pitched high-end condos, landscaped downtown plazas, designed a sensory garden for a rehab center. We grew revenue by 300% in 4 years. Leo and Eleni had full benefits. Aisha's VR tours set up clients for life. Marcus mentored our interns. But success has a way of breeding envy, especially in partnerships. I never saw the storm on the horizon. I never noticed how quiet our hallway could sound until the night Zoe's heels clicked past my door at 2 a.m. I'd been awake staring at the ceiling, mind replaying her offhand remark from dinner. "We're just treading water here, Dom." Her words washed over me like cold rain, but I shook them off and pretended I hadn't heard. The next morning, I tipped soil in my workshop, trying to coax sprouts from seed trays, but each pinch of earth felt heavier. Zoe slipped into our studio with that distant look, eyes bright but absence behind them. She'd spend hours pacing between my drafting table and her VR rig phone glued to her ear, murmuring about scale and vision. When I asked what was wrong, she'd flash a tired smile. "Nothing, just thinking." Yet every plant I touched seemed to shiver at her absence. I blamed myself. Had I grown too fixed on roots when she hungered for wings? I tried to match her energy, pitching new ideas, sketching rooftop forest concepts, even offering to learn her software. She'd nod politely, then close her laptop and walk out. That evening, I found her in the showroom staring at the award plaque we'd won 2 years ago. She traced our names with her finger, mine carved deep, hers etched just as faint. "You're stuck," she said softly. I felt the world tilt. What was I building if it trapped us both? And more terrifying, what if she was right? We landed the Uptown Tower pitch the next week, glass facades, sky gardens, an entire vertiginous ecosystem floating 20 stories up. Zoe was electric, no longer the quiet partner, but the high priestess of possibility. I watched her command the room, painting pictures of clients walking among orchids at sunset of glass floors, revealing koi ponds far below. I felt a spark when she looked at me, inviting me back into her vision, but then I saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes, as though she measured my face against some unseen benchmark. We spent nights poring over budgets and plant species lists, but our conversations twisted into debates. "You can't see the big picture," she'd say. "You're too sentimental." I'd fire back. This isn't about spreadsheets, it's life. In one heated moment, I slammed my hand on the table, sending a stack of soil samples tumbling. The echo in the showroom felt like thunder. Zoe stepped back, her jaw clenched. "Be careful what you smash," she warned, voice low. That night, I drove home past empty streetlights, stomach tangled. I realized we were playing different games. I'd dug trenches. She was drafting blueprints for escape. And I had to choose whether to dig my heels in or let the soil give way beneath us. Late one afternoon, I found her phone in the lounge, forgotten on the armrest screen, lit with a half-written text, "Have you spoken with Clayton yet?" My heart pounded as I unlocked it. There were messages dozens in a separate messaging app. I'd never seen photos of Zoe and a developer named Clayton at a bar, her arm hooked through his. Whispered plans about investment rounds and equity splits. My throat went dry. I scrolled until I crashed on bank alerts, a private account holding nearly $30,000 labeled Opportunity Fund. Beneath it, calendar invites for secret meetings. The betrayal cut sharper than any trowel. I closed the phone and sat in stunned silence, the afternoon light pooling on the carpet. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip my mug. Zoe had been building her own escape route and dragging the foundation from under us. I wanted to confront her, to roar with anger, but fear held my tongue. I realized I'd been watering a garden that was already being uprooted. And as I stared at the door, I felt a seed of something new, something dark and resolute take root in my chest. The next morning, I woke before dawn and slipped into the house, careful not to wake Zoe. My heart thudded as I stood outside her home office, its door ajar. I counted to 10, then pushed it open. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of her laptop. On the desk lay a manila envelope stuffed with contracts, some bearing my signature, others addressed to Clayton's company. A ring of coffee dripped onto blueprints titled Greendale Gardens 2.0. I rifled through them, each page a stitch in her betrayal charts, forecasting our split assets, drafts showing her as sole director of the new division, even notes on how to minimize Dominic's involvement. I felt a rush of fury and grief collide. My Uncle Julian's words echoed, "Gardens bend and break under the wrong hands." I straightened the papers, smoothing out the creases as though I could iron away her deception. A single dried petal lay on top, plucked from my favorite camellia. I picked it up and let it fall between my fingers like a silent accusation. My breath caught. This was more than a marriage falling apart. It was my life's work being rewritten without me. And in that flicker of dawn light, I understood that I stood at a crossroads, fight for the soil I'd tilled or walk away to let new roots find their own ground. My pulse raced as I heard her footsteps approaching. I closed the folder, braced myself against the desk, and prepared to face the storm I'd been blind to until now. I swung around as Zoe's silhouette filled the threshold of my home office. My hands still gripped the sheaf of contracts I'd uncovered at dawn. "So you found them," she said, voice flat. I held up the papers. "You were preparing to cut me out before you even told me." The hurt in her eyes didn't match the steel in her tone. She stepped forward, heels clicking like ominous metronomes on the hardwood. "I did what I had to do," she snapped, "because you're stuck." Dominic anchored to yesterday's dreams. Anger flared in my chest, but beneath it, a calm clarity took root. I had two choices: let her bulldoze my life's work or fight back. "You built your escape route," I said quietly. "Now you're trying to burn my house down around me." Her stare flickered as though she'd expected tears capitulation. Instead, I felt something else, a resolute pulse, the same force that once drove me to turn weeds into meadows. I slid the contracts into my satchel. "I'm taking action," I told her, voice steady. "See you in court." Zoe's expression cracked just for a heartbeat before it snapped back into place. "Good luck," she whispered, closing the door behind her. The click of the lock echoed in the empty room, and I realized the storm had finally arrived and I was standing in its eye. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with Marcus and Eleni, arranging a meeting at our old haunt, the Corner Cafe, where our dreams first felt possible. Marcus arrived, juggling 2 coffees and a hard hat. Eleni slipped in behind him, clutching her laptop and a sketchbook full of wild planting ideas. I laid out the plan file for a new LLC, secure a modest studio, call our loyal clients, and rebuild from scratch. Their eyes widened at the risks, the leases, the startup loan, the legal fees. But I saw something else there too, belief. "We've been through worse," Marcus said, and Eleni nodded. We passed around my phone as I called our attorney, the same one who'd handled my mom's will, affordable, practical, no corporate gloss. We sketched budgets on napkins, debated software costs versus old-fashioned hand renderings, and mapped a timeline that felt barely possible. Outside, the city's relentless hum carried the scent of asphalt and possibility. As I signed the lease agreement, hand trembling over the dotted line, I felt the weight of every year I'd poured into Greendale Gardens, now tethered to Zoe's half-share. My phone buzzed with a lawyer's text. "She's filed an injunction, no contacting joint clients." My heart pounded. Could we survive this blockade, or had she trapped me before I even started? That afternoon, I stared at the client list on my laptop, each name a testament to relationships I'd nurtured with soil and sincerity. Calling felt like betrayal and salvation all at once. My fingers hovered over the first number, Mrs. Abernathy, whose butterfly sanctuary we'd built together. I took a breath and dialed. Her warm voice answered on the second ring, and I spilled the situation in plain terms: divorce injunction, new venture, same dedication. There was a long silence. My stomach nodded, then she laughed softly. "I'll stand by you," she said. "Gardens that care for people matter more than flashy tech." One by one, other clients followed suit, the family who wanted a memorial grove, the cafe owner craving a sensory herb wall, the pediatrician designing a healing courtyard. Each call felt like a seed sprouting after a long drought. Yet when I tried to book site visits, Zoe's injunction hung over me like a fence I couldn't climb. My blood ran cold at the thought of legal wrangling draining our meager reserves. Still, the loyalty in those voices fortified me. They chose the human touch over hollow renderings. As dusk settled, I realized our struggle wasn't just about ownership. It was a clash of values, heart versus hype roots versus revenue. I closed my laptop, the glow fading into twilight, and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow, we break ground on our future." That night, sleep eluded me. I dreamt of seedlings cracking through concrete, of glass towers toppling under ivy. At dawn, I drove to the old industrial lot I'd eyed months ago, a hidden jewel waiting for a story. The chain-link gate creaked when I pushed it open. Concrete slabs cracked with weeds, rusted barrels held rainwater that gleamed like dark jewels. I inhaled deeply. This raw canvas was ours to transform far from Zoe's polished world. I flagged Marcus and Eleni, handing them gloves and trowels. We sketched our vision on a whiteboard propped against a graffitied wall, terraces of native grasses, reclaimed wood benches, a living mural of vines spelling out resilience. As we hammered stakes into the earth, my phone buzzed again, a message from Clayton, the developer Zoe had courted. He demanded immediate removal from the injunction if I hoped to continue her legacy project. My chest tightened. Collaborating with her con man felt like swallowing glass, but the project's scale could save us. I met Marcus's gaze. "We either forge ahead on our own terms," I said, "or hitch to his train and lose our soul." He tightened his gloves. Eleni nodded, her eyes bright with possibility. The sky above was steel, threatening rain, but our hands in the soil felt electric. Somewhere beyond the fence, Zoe's world kept spinning in digital spin cycles. Here, our future would sprout from honest sweat and stubborn roots. As the first raindrops fell, I realized that every drop would test our resolve, and that the real battle for Greendale's heart had only just begun. I walked into the courtroom with a single sprig of rosemary taped to my lapel. a reminder that even in the hardest places, green life can persist. Zoe's lawyer sat behind her with a smug smile, a stack of glossy brochures fanned out like a deck of cards, signaling her innovations. The judge peered at me over his bench while I set my satchel on the table. Inside were my sketches, my contracts, and the seed packet I planned to crack open outside after the hearing. I spoke slowly, each word measured. This isn't just a matter of dollars or ownership. It's about what gardens mean to people. Roots, community, healing. I built Greendale Gardens to be more than a commodity. The lawyer countered, "Mr. Reyes, you undervalue your wife's digital contributions." I stood and held up the rosemary, its thin leaves trembling in the courtroom light. Digital renderings fade. Living plants endure. My hands shaped every bed, every stone. My vision gave life to soil, not pixels. A hush fell. The judge tapped his pen, paused, and asked for a recess. My heart pounded like a drum in silence. When the bailiff motioned us out, Zoe's eyes flicked past me to that green sprig. I clenched my fist, feeling the weight of every trial I'd survived. Outside, the courthouse steps stretched wide, and I realized the outcome still hung in the balance like a seed waiting for rain. The next morning, the sky opened in a downpour as I led Marcus and Eleni through the half-abandoned lot we'd claimed for our new venture. Rain drummed on the corrugated roof of the leased barn we'd converted into a makeshift studio. We spread our plans across a battered table, the ink running at the edges of our sketches. I'd just received a call from Clayton Zoe's secret partner offering to lift the injunction if I agreed to design his city-wide green corridors under his terms, strict deadlines, corporate patents, profit sharing that would tether me to his vision. My pulse raced. Accepting would mean breathing new life into Greendale Gardens again, but at the cost of my independence. Declining meant dragging my team through years of uncertainty. Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face earnest. "Dom, this is your chance to cash in what she tried to bury." Eleni traced her finger on a blueprint of vine-draped trellises. "Or we risk everything, build our own legacy." I stared at the rain-soaked ground, imagining roots pushing through concrete. I thought of the rosemary on my lapel, still green against judgment. With a steady voice, I shook my head. "We'll do it our way." A thunderclap shook the rafters as if the sky itself questioned my resolve, leaving us in that drenched silence poised on the knife's edge between safety and faith. That afternoon, I organized the first community planting at the old lot, invited neighbors whose voices had been drowned out by condo developments and chain stores. Word spread by handbills and word of mouth, no tech campaigns, no 3D walkthroughs. Families arrived with shovels, laughter, and skepticism. An elderly woman in a wheelchair brought a single marigold saying, "My son works downtown." They tore down a park for an office tower. "I want to plant this here so someone remembers what sunlight feels like." A group of teens painted a mural on the side wall roots cradling the city skyline. As I handed out seedlings, a city councilman in a crisp suit appeared, clipboard in hand. "This is an unauthorized use of land," he announced, glancing at the mural with thinly veiled distaste. A murmur rose among volunteers. I squared my shoulders and replied, "Our city needs green spaces more than it needs more glass towers." The councilman frowned and said, "We'll see whose vision the public supports." He left, leaving a crack of tension that pulsed through the group. I felt my chest tighten, the cheers of the crowd mingling with fear in my gut. As we began digging trenches for native wildflowers, the horizon darkened with storm clouds, and I wondered if our grassroots rebellion could outshine corporate approval or if the rain would wash away our hopeful seeds before they even sprouted. When dawn broke, I stood at the edge of the lot, breathing in the scent of wet earth and fresh growth. Dozens of marigolds, rosemary, and native grasses lined the paths we carved yesterday. My phone buzzed with a text. The injunction had been lifted overnight. Clayton's terms had collapsed under public pressure after the morning news showed our planting and mural. I could taste both victory and unease. Zoe's silhouette appeared at the gate, her designer coat stiff with rain. She carried a sleek tablet and wore a look of practiced calm that didn't reach her eyes. "I heard the injunction was dropped," she said. "You played the community card." I folded my arms, the mud squishing between my boots. "I planted more than seeds yesterday. I planted trust." She stepped forward, voice low. "This lot is my investment too. If you want to keep it, you'll need a bigger plan." I glanced at the mural roots entwining the skyline and felt a surge of clarity. My plan is simple. We grow this together, or you step aside and let it belong to the people. Zoe's chest heaved, her next move impossible to read. The sky cracked open with sunlight casting her in a halo of glare and shadow. I met her gaze, knowing that whatever she chose now would decide not just the fate of this garden, but whether my roots or her ambitions would claim the fertile ground between us. And in that split moment, I realized our story was still unfolding one uncertain petal at a time.